From Temple University, this is Profiles in Literature. Prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
I'm Jaqueline Shachter, and I teach children's literature at Temple University. Temple is pleased to present another outstanding children's author in its Profiles in Literature series in cooperation with the Free Library of Philadelphia. Let us welcome Eleanor Cameron. Mrs. Cameron, you're used to sending several of your characters, Chuck and David, to the Mushroom Planet by rocket ship. Didn't your flight from California by plane, in comparison, seem relatively mild?
Well, yes, indeed, very mild, because I couldn't see anything except cloud cover. So I just went to sleep, except for the part coming over the Rockies, and that was most beautiful. I did see the snow, but it was a very, very sedate journey. Hardly a wiggle.
We're glad you could make it.
Well, I am too. Marvelous to be here.
Assisting are Rosemary Weber, Professor of Children's Literature at Drexel University's Graduate School of Library Science, and Carolyn Field, Director of the Office on Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia, and co-sponsor with Temple of our series of videotapes on important children's authors and illustrators. In order for you to appreciate the scope of Mrs. Cameron's work, we have some sample illustrations from her books. These, by Robert Henneberger, are for The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. And for Stowaway to the Mushroom Planet. And these by Joe and Beth Crush are for The Terrible Chernodrine. Trina Shard-Hyman did this photograph or illustration for the 1971 realistic fiction, A Room Made of Windows. I asked Mrs. Cameron to bring some photographs with her that would explain some of her work, and I wonder if you would tell us something about these photographs. We have some that relate to your book settings.
Now, did you want me to...
We'll have to wait for... Here's the first one.
Oh, yes. Well, this is the Monterey Peninsula, and on the Monterey Peninsula, this is a point of land about 130 miles south of San Francisco on the Pacific coast. And it's a most beautiful place. And I have loved it ever since I was, about 12 when we first started to go there. And it stayed in my mind all those years, so that when I came to The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet, when David asked me to do that, I immediately saw the action taking place on the Monterey coast. And I chose Pacific Grove because it is such a little place that David and Chuck could easily find a little cove there to set off their little rocket ship where nobody would disturb them. And this is a walk going around a very beautiful precipitous point of land where I placed the mysterious Christmas shell. And I am about to walk up the trail there to go around that. And this is a lookout from what I call sea meadows in the book, but which is really Point Lobos. And there is a very steep path going around that.
Didn't a Spellis cast also take place there?
It also takes place on those are my three big Sir books, The Terrible Chernodrine, The Mysterious Christmas Shell, and The Spellis cast. They all take place on that coast. And this is the garden outside my study window. That's on one side, but there's a big, huge corner window, and I face a little forest of oak trees, so it's a very beautiful place to work.
Here is the lad who inspired The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet and subsequent Mushroom Planet books. Who is in the picture with you?
Well, this is a picture of David when he was a very small boy. He was, even then though, he was reading. Oh, let's see, I think he's about 6 in that picture, but he was a tremendous reader. And, well, you can't see it. Oh, there we are. David is standing there at the side of my table, and I am turned from the typewriter and going over a manuscript, probably of the 2nd novel, which was never accepted. And David, about this time, came to me and said, "Well, Mom, what is the use of trying to write any more books for grown-ups? Nobody's ever going to read them anyway, so you might as well write a book for David, or Chuck and me." And at that time, I had no intention of writing books for children, but he persuaded me to. And overnight, absolutely overnight, came this idea for The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. I went to bed at night, having had David ask me to do a book for him, and I woke up in the morning, and there it was. It was like a gift. It really was a gift. And I went into David's room, and I said, "David, what do you suppose?" And he said, "Oh, I know. You got an idea." I said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Well, I just knew you would." So I told him, and he said, "It's absolutely marvelous." He said, "You go and make the beds and do the dishes and get busy." So I did. And every morning after that.
Did he not do some illustrations
Yes,
himself?
and this is the first illustration that he did. It was his book, completely from beginning to end, and so he was going to do the illustrations, and I don't know how well this is going to show up.
Fairly
but
well
anyway, that is David and Chuck and their little spaceship. And here is Thallow Street. And I don't know if you can see or not, but he numbered the houses oddly, you know, I mean 1, 3, 5. And I didn't even realize that until I got these pictures out to bring them to you. And my husband said, "Look, at the age of 7, he realized that houses were numbered alternately." I don't even know that I noticed it. And this is Mr. Bass inside his little observatory. But David, there are millions of pictures that I have.
And from Japan comes this illustrated copy of The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. You see I open it from the opposite.
See, it opens at the back. You go to the back, and then you go from the top to the bottom.
And notice, can we get, yes, notice atop.
Mr. Bass has a mushroom growing out of the top of his head. And this, I think, is, you know, really additional creation, because I never thought of Mr. Bass like that. And this is to the Japanese people, the little mushroom planet, and they made a TV show of it. So someday I must go over to Japan and ask if I could see the TV show. And this is, according to one of my little fans, he's no longer a little boy, this is Ta, the ruler of Basidium, and this boy started writing to me when he was, well, it's been 6 years, and he's 15 now, so you see how old he was when he started writing me. And he has written me over a period of years 80 letters like this, perfectly beautiful. 3 and 4 typewritten pages, single space. I think this boy is a genius. And his letters are so perceptive, and he knows children's literature. I think he could give any teacher of children's literature a run for their money, the books that he has read. And this is a Valentine that Steve did for me. And you open it up, and here he's lifting up his arms to my photograph saying, "Be mine." And not long ago, on his 14th birthday, he's now 15, he came out from Texas to spend his birthday with me in California. Now this, I think, is devotion. This is the little king giving the keys to Allison in A Beast with a Magical Horn.
All of these done by Steve.
All done by Steve. And I have no idea what this boy is going to be. This is a Horatio Q. Peabody in Stowaway to the Mushroom Planet. And this is David on the Mushroom Planet on the unknown side, wandering around among the ruins of long-lost Basidium. And this is A Spell is Cast.
It's just perfect for A Spell is Cast, just perfect.
And this is, I think, a far better illustration for Time and Mr. Bass than the illustrator I chose the illustrator, and I did not do a good job of choosing. And this is a far better illustration than my illustrator did. And this is a suggested book jacket for the Green and Burning Tree.
I want to tell you, I'll take you away from this to your 1971 piece of realistic fiction. I really believe that A Room Made of Windows is one of my favorite books. And I want to project something. I believe it to be somewhat autobiographical, that Julia was actually you as a child, and that you must have known quite early that you wanted to be a writer. Is this so?
Yes. Yes, I think I knew at the age of 11, at least, that I wanted to be a writer. I've had so many places that I was 12, but actually I began writing when I was 11. And I suppose it was when I was 12 that my stories and poems first began being accepted by the Berkeley Young Authors page. And I have told so many little towns, please start a Young Authors page in your daily paper, because there's nothing like encouraging children to write and to pay attention to the written word and to love words as having a weekly page for young writers, because you have to see yourself in print. I mean, this is the marvelous thing. So from that time on, I began.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you what might be a very sensitive question, and you don't have to answer. Well, I want to know if you, like Julia, the main character in A Room Made of Windows, also set up some impediments to your mother's remarriage.
Yes, really my reaction to Uncle Phil, as I called him in the book, was exactly as I had it there. I was a very headstrong, stubborn, passionate child, and everything that I said, and I remembered myself exactly as I put myself down. My mother said, "Oh, you weren't nearly that bad," and I said, "Well, if anything, I was probably worse." But I absolutely adored my mother. She was my property because we hadn't seen my father for a long time. Incidentally, my mother and father were divorced. I didn't lose him by death, as it was in the book. And I hadn't seen him for a long time, and my mother was my own private property. And here came this man whom I had looked upon as a family friend, and all of a sudden he loomed as someone who's going to take my mother away from me. So I put up a fight, and even after Mother was married, I continued to put up a fight, and it was not an easy time. In fact, it was one of the most difficult periods that my precious mother had to face, and she faced many.
Was Greg in the book your brother?
No, I have never had a brother, and Greg is David.
Your own son?
My own son, and I asked him if it was all right. He said, "Okay, Mom, but don't you tell anything I wouldn't want told." And I said, "Can I say that you had a very messy room?" And he said, "Yeah, that's okay, but don't go any further." And so I didn't. And he read the book after. I didn't give him the manuscript. I questioned him closely, but he was busy at the time, so I gave him a copy, naturally, of the published copy, and he read through it, and he phoned me and he said, "Mom, it's okay," but he said, "It's funny," you know, to see yourself in a book as somebody else sees you.
We have some photographs from the Room Made of Windows. I wonder if we could see them, and Mrs. Cameron could tell us something
Now,
about
this is myself when young. I was about 22 there, on board the ferry that went back and forth across San Francisco Bay. And, oh, when I was a child, I loved those ferry boats. They were just a part of my life, and to go over to San Francisco was the most exciting thing. And I called the little restaurant where my mother would take me on my birthday the Green Door, but actually it was the Green Gate, where we had popovers as big as baseballs. Oh, what popovers. And you see how long my skirts were in the 1930s when I was married. And there are the seagulls lined up along the edge of the railing there, which was exactly the way they used to be. And we always took bags of crust to feed the seagulls, and it was just a lovely time.
I think he has some pictures. There is your ferry.
There's the ferry boat that Greg and Julia went over to San Francisco for Julia to be left with Aunt Alex and Uncle, my goodness, his name's Uncle Hugh. It's funny how you can forget your own characters. That's ridiculous.
Well, he has some pictures there of your son.
Now, this is myself and my little mother, who would have been Celia Redfern, and David now is 6'4", and he is an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission. That was David graduating from Pomona, and he is a very tall boy and a very, very dear and loving son.
Papa Chandler is in one of your
Daddy,
photographs.
Daddy
Chandler.
Chandler,
Let's
yes.
see if we can't get that photograph on the board.
Daddy Chandler.
No, this is not quite that.
No, that's Berkeley. Now, in A Room Made of Windows, when they're up at Uncle Phil's new house, they look across a sea of foliage to the campanile, and that was the center of Berkeley, the campanile. Well, it still is, because it's so beautiful. And Daddy Chandler. Here is myself when a child, just the age Julia would have been, and that's Daddy Jefferson. Daddy Jefferson always maintained that Joe Jefferson, who played Rip Van Winkle for many years, well, I tell about that at the end of The Green and Burning Tree. He maintains that Joe Jefferson was his uncle. And he told me all about the Civil War, and he and I had the most wonderful times together. Talk about age gap. There simply wasn't any. I was in Daddy Jefferson's hip pocket.
That's very well conveyed in A Room Made of Windows. Do either of you have questions relative to A Room Made of Windows?
I do.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
I too like the book. I think it's a marvelous book, but I think there are so many stories in it. In fact, you could make other books of the various characters in the story. And it seems to me that love is one of the major themes in the individual stories. The love of a mother for a child, and the child for the mother, and the friend, and all the different characters. I wondered whether you had a central theme for the writing of the book.
Oh, definitely. I think it is the discovery by Julia that her mother is not her own private property, that her mother, and I think it takes most children quite a while to realize that their parents are not extensions of themselves. Now, you see, I was not at the point yet in the book where I wanted to be separate. I mean, when you really become a teenager, then your parents, you want them to move out of the picture, and you want to be your own person. But I still wanted my mother to be mine, and I wanted to be hers. And so it took Rhiannon Moore, who was the friend, to say, look, your mother isn't your private property. She has her own life. And I was told that, I didn't put this in the book, but I was told that I was so selfish that it was inconceivable, you know. And so for the first time in my life, my eyes were open to the fact that Mother had her own life to live, that she had to think about the future, that she wanted love. You know, she wanted the love of a man. She didn't want just her children's love. It wasn't the be-all and the end-all.
I don't know of any other book that does quite as good a job with that same theme. In the audience are students of children's literature, colleagues from Temple University, and librarians, including Mary Elizabeth Ledley, the coordinator of youth services for the Milwaukee Public Library. Wonder if any of you have something you want to say relative to A Room Made of Windows, just that book right now. Mrs.
I'd like to ask about Rhiannon Moore. To me, she was one of the most interesting characters in the book. Was this a real person?
No, Rhiannon Moore was a most strange person. When I think of the beginning of that book, I don't know how I ever expected to have a book when I first started out. But as I was thinking about it, and this was before it began to be written, I, in my imagination, went out into the back garden of the little brown house with the white roof, and all of a sudden, from the big old red house next door, a woman came out with her hair hanging around her shoulders. She had a dressing gown on, and I knew right away that she was one of those women who'd lived as she wanted to live. She didn't get dressed up clean and neat and just so in the morning, that if she wanted to stay practicing at the piano all day in her house coat, she did. And she came to the fence and leaned over the fence, and we began to talk. And I had just been reading Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Sword. What is it? The Sword at Sunset. And there was Rhiannon in there. And I thought this was the most The Birds of Rhiannon. In fact, I've one day got to write a book called The Birds of Rhiannon. And so I knew she was Irish for some reason, and I thought her name is Rhiannon Moore, and she has a son named Oren Moore, and he is a great pianist. I mean, it was as if they had been living next door. And she becomes almost the center of the book. Now, if anybody can explain to me how this happens and why it happens. And in the book that I've just written, Time is a River Without Banks, a fantasy, I don't, again, know how I thought I was going to have a book, because I have some stone children in a courtyard, and upon them rests the book. You know, it's really spooky.
I want to discuss just that. Something about how you go about writing. You know, many of my students have difficulty understanding what is meant by the writer's style. Wonder if you would discuss your definition of style, the sound of self, and tell us how you will achieve your unique style.
Well, I think it takes years, because I grew, well, from the time I was 20, I grew up, and I had a lot of growing to do after 20, which is what so many people don't understand who want to be writers. There are very few Truman Capotes who start when they're 18. But I did not get a style for a long time. I mean, it was there, I was myself, but I hadn't written enough. And I adored Virginia Woolf. I mean, Virginia Woolf was the center of my existence. So when I wrote The Unheard Music, it was echoing Virginia Woolf's style. And I couldn't help it. I could hear Virginia Woolf in my head. And if I wasn't sounding like Virginia Woolf, then I wasn't, to me, sounding like myself. So a friend of mine said, well, I like the Unheard Music very much, but you have got to be yourself. And it wasn't until David asked me to write a book. I was not going to write The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet in the style of Virginia Woolf. And this enabled me to be myself, and I started out listening to the children. And I got a simple style. You see, now Virginia Woolf's style is not complex, but I went from Virginia Woolf to me. And from that time on, I more and more sounded like myself until probably The Green and Burning Tree did something, because I am a different writer, in a way, a more reflective writer. The Spell is Cast came before The Green and Burning Tree, and everything that I write from now on is going to be, I think, deeper and more complex spiritually and aesthetically because of The Green and Burning Tree, because of the searching and the exploration. But as Dr. Shachter said, for me, style is the sound of self. It is sound. You're listening all the time. You're listening. But it's got to be you, and you have to have a self. You have to have a self in order to sound like self.
Rosemary Weber, it's your turn.
I've been wondering, since you said at the beginning that you really had no intention of writing a children's book until David asked you to do this, that whether you have felt constrained in any way in developing your style from the fact that you're writing a children's book rather than an adult book.
Well, of course, I did not feel any constraint whatsoever in writing Wonderful Flight or any of the Mr. Bass books, nor in any of the books. Well, I've never felt any constraint. Now, the next book that's going to come along is going to pose a bit of a problem. But because I was writing for children, I was being a child. I had looked forward to the problem of the relationship between Julia and her mother in a room made of windows, and wanting her mother to be frank with her, as she would be with a 12-year-old girl, saying that the love of her children wasn't enough. She wanted the love of a man. But there was no difficulty there. I didn't run into, it didn't, and I've never had any restrictions as far as words were concerned. I never had to, it seemed to me, if you can put atomic tritetramethyl benzocarbon ethylene in a book, you can put any word you want. And I think all this restriction of words for children is absolutely absurd. Children, as a matter of fact, can fight their way through most words. It's the difficult philosophical and sexual problems that children are shut off from because they really haven't arrived at that stage yet. But now the next book I'm going to write, it's strange how I have worked my way, I'm working my way back to the novel. And I haven't consciously done this, but you see I'm wanting to present more and more adult things. And so now the book I've just finished oh, it's not, there's no particular problem there. But now the next book, which I think is going to be called A Love of Green Mountains, will be about black people and white people, but going back to when I was a child. And, oh, there are many things that are going to be interesting for me to get into that I haven't thought about before. And how I'm going to present them, I don't know. But I know the book will open it up. I know, but it's going to be more adult than anything I've yet done. And more adult in many ways.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cameron. In 1959, Mrs. Cameron's book, The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet, was the choice of children in Hawaii for the Nenni Prize. In 1965, she was awarded both the Mystery Writers of America Award and the Commonwealth Award for her book, A Spell is Cast. And in that same year, the Southern California Council on Children's Literature cited her distinguished contributions. She's also written for adults. You've heard reference to a magnificent work, The Green and Burning Tree, a volume that deals with literary criticism, which is used by many college seminars in children's literature. She also writes for the Hornbook magazine. It's been a pleasure to have you as our guest.
Thank you, Dr. Shachter. It's been